A judge on Brazil's Superior Electoral Court recently banned the platform X for operating in the country. X said in a statement that it's being punished for refusing to comply with the judge's illegal orders to censor his political opponents. So here to join us is Preston Byrne, tech lawyer and senior fellow at the Adam Smith Institute. So Preston, what's been the reaction to Brazil banning X so far?
Depends really on who you talk to. If you talk to people on the center left or European regulators or Brazilian regulators for that matter, they tend to celebrate this because they think that Elon and X has been problematic for global discourse, and they want people who are speaking on X to be quiet. If you tend to talk to people who are more on the libertarian axis, they're unhappy with it because it's certainly an interesting and novel development to see people in the United States cheering on censorship when traditionally the United States has been the home of free speech for the world.
Preston, so you wrote today, people can find it at theblaze.com/return, this piece about the globalist push to arrest Elon Musk. Can you just lay out, who is trying to arrest him and why?
I'm not sure they're trying to arrest him. Well, at least anyone in positions of power is trying to arrest him. And also the term globalist, I will add, was a term that the Blaze added rather than myself. I had a rather different title. But what I'll say is
editors,
there are individuals. Editors, exactly. I like my editor a lot, but he's given plenty of creative license. So what I'd say is that the individuals who tend to be writing tend to be the commentariat. They're not people who are part of the regulatory apparatus. They don't have a really firm hold or understanding on social media law in the United States. For example, Robert Reich, who is a former U.S. Secretary of Commerce, U.S. Secretary of Labor, has called for Elon's arrest and also for intervention by the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. Now, those suggestions in the United States, the U.S. is never going to extradite Elon for running X in the manner he chooses in the United States. And the Federal Trade Commission is barred by federal statute from imposing civil penalties for what they suggest is the problem here, which is that Elon isn't moderating content appropriately. I think there are certainly there are political forces outside of the United States, particularly in the European Union, United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, which want to exercise greater control of the online information space. And they might be receptive to these ideas more so than, for example, in the United States or U.S. law enforcement, which is prohibited from doing so. So this is really a decentralized ideological phenomenon. I think people are trying to move the Overton window to encourage European regulators to act more aggressively against X. I think an arrest is pretty much out of the question, but that's not preventing people from suggesting it.
Now, that 50,000-foot view with what you're talking about right now, we see France arresting the Telegram CEO, this happening in Brazil with X. We see UK citizens being arrested for what they post on social media. So where do we go from here? And is there going to be a return to sanity at some point in this? Or as once the pendulum starts going one way, does history show that it really just continues down that road for quite some time?
That's a really good question. I think X, for the first time ever, is really the first example of a global company or a company of global scale pushing back on censorship by simply refusing to play ball. Google, Facebook, other companies have historically said that they wouldn't, for example, cooperate with Chinese surveillance and censorship. But this is the first time that a big American tech platform has refused to play ball with a country which is ostensibly an American ally. So it's really a battle of wills. Regulators in places like Europe and Brazil are not really in a great position because what they're learning is that if an American decides they're going to exercise their free speech rights in the United States, there's not a whole lot they can do about it except one of two options. They can either censor their own people, which is what Brazil has chosen to do, or they could militarily invade the United States and seize the servers in Texas, which obviously is not going to happen in the case of Brazil versus the United States. So the harder they crack down on their own people, it kind of creates a legitimacy problem for them, because on the one hand, yes, they are taking back control of the information space, but on the other hand, they're setting fire to their own legitimacy in the process. The Brazilian constitution has express mention of that censorship is not permitted in the constitution, and yet what's clearly happening here is censorship. So I would imagine that a lot of Brazilians are looking at this situation and starting to question, the legitimacy of the government's actions in view of those provisions.
Preston, that's a great point. What's at stake in a lot of what's going on in Western politics is legitimacy. I think the rule of law itself and what legitimizes it is at the root of a lot of these disputes. So let me push back on that a little bit and get your take on where this goes, given that America is going into the election into November. And if history is any guide, recent history is any guide, you'd expect them to get worse here in terms of censorship, right? As there's political pressure and pressure from powerful forces to censor even more. And so where do you think this goes? And particularly with Brazil, how does that end, given that even though they're sort of revealing themselves and going against the Constitution and angering Brazilian citizens, regulators here and in Europe seem to be A-OK with this, and they seem to be ready for the fight?
It's really difficult for American regulators to intervene because the First Amendment is a really very strong bulwark against that type of intervention in the United States. So regardless of the outcome of the election, unless you fundamentally reshape the Supreme Court and then manage to hurry litigation up to the top of the ladder very, very quickly, I don't think you're going to see too much regulatory intervention from the United States. If you talk to analysts like Mike Benz, for example, his theory, and I can't back it because I'm not a reporter or an analyst and I don't have firsthand knowledge of this, but his theory is that the United States and certain forces within the U.S. State Department in particular are using foreign proxies in order to carry out via the back door what the U.S. government can't carry out via the front. It's an interesting theory. I think we've seen certainly that, for example, Mark Zuckerberg recently revealed in a letter that he'd been jawboned by the Biden administration in order to censor user content. Jawboning is a legal term of art, meaning the government pressuring people to exercise their free speech rights in particular ways or to censor people in particular ways. And so I think what we see is that it's informal pressure or pressure outside of the U.S. legal system, which is the preferred method for people within the U.S. government who don't like the kind of content that a company like X or Gab or Rumble or Truth Social or any other number of smaller companies are hosting online.
Just to be clear real quick on this, so you think that there'll be less intervention, let's call it, or informal direct or indirect pressure in the United States with companies like Facebook, X, Google this time around?
I think if Trump wins, there will be far less pressure because I think the Trump administration fundamentally is going to be staffed by people who respect the First Amendment. If Harris wins, I think that their interpretation of the law is that it's a flexible rather than a static principle. And so they should start bending it to modern standards and conventions, and that they should be cracking down on things like hate speech. So I think the U.S. picture will substantially be dictated by who wins the election. But in the event that you have a victory of a Harris administration, the defendants in any civil regulatory actions that they bring or criminal actions that they might bring, the defenses would be much stronger because we have this 200 odd years of First Amendment jurisprudence backing it up. Offshore, I expect the pressure is actually going to ramp up in places like the United Kingdom or Germany or France. The Pavel Durov case with Telegram, as you mentioned, is one example of the French government really doing something which is truly unprecedented, which is holding a platform liable for just being a little loosey-goosey on its content moderation standards. At least as the allegations go, it's really without precedent in the last 30 years of social media, and is going to be changing the regulatory posture that a lot of these companies have towards operating in France going forward.